I wasn't in a good place that fall, and if I'm being plain, winter didn't improve me much at first. I was 48, a diesel mechanic who could rebuild an injector pump blindfolded, and I was on unpaid leave because I'd had a panic spell on the shop floor that left me sitting against a tool chest, trying to breathe like a man surfacing through ice. 2 months before that, my mother died in her sleep. 6 months before that, my wife signed the last divorce paper and slid her ring into a glass bowl by the front door like she was returning a library book. I came back to my dad's cedar-sided homestead outside Kettle Ridge, telling folks I needed to winterize it and sell it. That was the story. The truer version was, I couldn't picture a life beyond making it to bedtime without coming apart. The house had my father's habits still tucked into it, even though he'd been gone 3 years. Coffee tins in descending size on the pantry shelf, a chipped ceramic trout on the windowsill over the sink, a coffee ring on the workbench where he set his mug while filing chain teeth. I moved through those rooms like I was trespassing in my own last name. Most mornings I kept the family photos face down on the mantel because if I looked at my mother smiling under her church hat, or my daughter Emmy at 12 with braces and 2 missing front teeth, my chest tightened so hard I had to brace one hand against the wall. So I didn't look. I split wood. I patched fence staples. I microwaved leftovers in old butter tubs. I went to bed with the TV on low so I didn't have to hear my own head. My only steady company was Mags, my old blue heeler, 12 years, and stiff in one hip but still sharper than half the men I'd ever worked with. She watched everything, judged everybody, and barked at anything that moved where it shouldn't, including mailboxes she considered suspicious, and one particular birch stump that leaned like a man in a coat. At night she slept beside the back door on a frayed horse blanket, one ear up even in her dreams. During the day she made rounds with me, nose low, tail level, stopping every so often to make sure I was still following. More than once I caught myself talking to her like she was a foreman. Fence line first, then north pump, I'd tell her. She'd blink like I was behind schedule. In town I kept conversations short because pity and advice arrived in equal quantities, and I couldn't carry either. At Harlan's feed, old Pete Carver asked how long I planned to stay out at the Holloway place. I said, long enough to keep pipes from blowing and get a buyer. He nodded like he believed me, then said, that ridge gets lonely in January. Keep your stove fed. At the register, Claire from the diner slid me an extra packet of hand warmers and said, on the house, Roy. I thanked her and stared at the card reader like it required a certification. Everybody meant well. Nobody knew what to do with a man who had outlived his own plans. The panic spells came mostly at dusk, when daylight thinned and the house got quiet in a way that pressed in from all sides. I'd be doing nothing dramatic, just rinsing a plate or folding a flannel, and suddenly my heart took off like I'd run uphill. Hands numb, vision narrow, a loud humming in my ears. The first few times I thought I was having a heart attack. ER said stress response, gave me pamphlets and breathing exercises printed in cheerful colours. I taped one by the fridge and ignored it for a week. Then one night I did it, counted in for 4, held for 4, out for 6, while Mags leaned her weight against my shin. It worked enough to keep me upright. That counted as progress. What I couldn't tell anybody was how small my life had gotten. Not peaceful small, frightened small. In my head, every day had one rule. Do the next thing, and don't look past it. Chop this round. Carry this bucket. Tighten this hinge. Don't think about my daughter living 3 states over with a father who sent birthday money and no honest letter. Don't think about my mother's last voicemail, still saved because deleting it felt like a second funeral. Don't think about the shop, or the men covering my bays, or whether they called me unstable when I wasn't there. Just keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. There are days now when I can name that as grief, burnout, shame, all braided together. Back then, it just felt like weight. By early December, the ridge had taken on that hard, metallic cold that made every sound carry. I spent one day under the house wrapping pipe with heat tape and foam sleeves, cursing my father's optimism about 1970s insulation. I set stock tank heaters in the lower pasture and tested the fence alarm by the carving shed, a little solar unit that chirped in the kitchen if voltage dropped. I cleaned the flue, stacked oak by the porch, and moved the old generator out where I could start it blind at midnight. Practical work steadied me. There was a right way to do it, a wrong way to do it, and no room for opinion. That kind of certainty felt like medicine. Then one sleeting dawn I stepped out with Mags and knew something was off before I could name it. The tree line behind the woodpile usually woke loud, jays fussing, squirrels rattling branches, crows arguing like old mechanics. That morning it was still as a held breath. Not dead still, not empty, just quiet in a patient way, like the woods were listening. The sleet tapped on my jacket hood. Somewhere far down canyon water moved under thin ice. Mag stood with one paw lifted and her ears pointed toward the firs. She didn't bark, she didn't bristle, she just watched. I told myself there were a dozen ordinary reasons for quiet. Weather shifts, predators passing through, a hawk roosting nearby. I'd grown up on that property and knew the difference between nerves and weather, but I preferred weather. I preferred anything with a chart and a probable cause. I walked the perimeter anyway, checked latches, kicked snow off the gate track, and found tracks by the woodpile that weren't mine and weren't deer. Bigger than my size 11 boot by a long stretch. Deep, wide. The strides circled out from the trees and back again, never coming straight to the house, never crossing the porch light spill. I stood there too long with sleet soaking my shoulders and said out loud, "Great, bear with custom shoes." That first week I found prints 3 more times after fresh dustings, always near the woodpile, always swinging wide around the back of the house. Once they ended near the old horse trough where Mags liked to nap in late sun. She walked over, sniffed the ground, and sat down with a slow tail thump, not wary, not keyed up, just considering. I laughed because the alternative was to get rattled, and I was tired of being rattled. The next morning, half bored and half ornery, I poured an extra mug of black coffee and set it on the stump beside the back steps. "For whoever keeps stepping where I just raked," I muttered, because talking to open air had become part of my winter skill set. Mags looked from me to the mug like she was grading my judgment. It became routine, faster than I'll admit, with pride. I brewed 1 pot, filled my thermos, set 1 enamel mug on that stump, and went about chores. Some mornings the mug was untouched. Some mornings it sat empty with a ring of cooled grounds at the bottom. Once it was moved 3 feet to the left and set beside a spray of wild rose hips that hadn't been there before. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just small rearrangements with a kind of care to them. No paw marks knocked over the tin, no clawing, no torn trash, no raided feed bins. Whatever was passing through the edge of my place moved like it respected boundaries better than most people I knew. I tried to logic it flat. Neighbour prank. Though my nearest neighbour was 2 miles, and arthritic. Bear behaviour. Though no bear I'd seen in 48 years placed mugs upright. Sleep deprivation. Though Mags witnessed the same things, and had better instincts than me on my best day. One afternoon I drove into town for diesel and mentioned the tracks to Pete in a sideways way, asked if he'd seen large sign near his north field. He rubbed his chin and said, "Saw some deep impressions by the creek after that first freeze. Could be drift and melt messing with size. Then he gave me a look I'd seen old ranchers give weather radios. Or could be this ridge keeping its own company. Either way, keep your stock tight. That was all. No joke, no lecture. Just room for not knowing. The first unmistakable kindness came after a freezing rain that glazed everything in a clear shell. I woke to branches ticking, stepped outside and nearly skated on the porch boards. I expected my kindling pile to be ruined because I'd left part of it uncovered by the woodshed in a lazy moment the day before. But under the small blue tarp by the chopping block sat a neat stack of pencil-dry sticks, sorted by thickness like someone had done inventory. Tinder curls, finger-width splits, then wrist-thick pieces, all dry to the touch. Not one had ice on it. I stood there with my hand on the tarp edge, feeling that old practical part of me begin to argue and the rest of me go very still. Mags was already beside the stack, seated polite as church, tail thumping once every few seconds. She looked at me, then at the kindling, then back to me, patient as a nurse waiting for a stubborn man to take his medicine. "You saw this, huh?" I said, her ears tipped forward. "You're not bothered." Tail thump. "You trust it." Another thump, slower this time, and she lowered her chin onto her paws like the matter was settled. I actually said thank you to the tree line then, feeling foolish and relieved in the same breath. The woods stayed quiet. The sleet eased. Somewhere above us a single jay started up again, sharp and bright, and for the first time in months, I felt curious before I felt tired. I stood there another minute, with my hand still on the tarp, listening to that one jay fuss, and then quiet down again, like the ridge had decided it had said enough for now. The cold worked through my gloves, and I finally tucked the dry kindling under my arm and carried it inside, with Mags pacing at my heel and glancing back over her shoulder toward the firs every few steps. Inside, the stove had burned low to red eyes and ash. I knelt, laid out 3 of those pencil-dry sticks, and struck a match. Flame took right away, clean and fast, no hiss from hidden moisture. I added 2 more and watched fire settle in like it had been waiting for them. Whoever had stacked that wood knew exactly what dry sounded like when it caught. Mags lay down by the door and sighed once, deep from the ribs. Not a worried sound at all. The house warmed by degrees, cedar walls ticking soft as the temperature climbed, and I kept looking from the stove to the back window, like I expected an explanation to walk up and knock. I made oatmeal and ate it standing at the counter. Halfway through, I set my spoon down and said, "All right, let's do this proper." Mags lifted her head. "You and I are going to inspect for pranksters, neighbors, bears with tool belts, and any other reasonable option." She blinked at me without moving. "You look skeptical. I appreciate that." For a second I laughed at myself, this middle-aged wreck in thermal socks holding a bowl and briefing a cattle dog like we were detectives on retainer. It was either laugh or feel that tightness in my chest again, and I preferred laughing. By noon I'd walked every easy approach to the house, then the hard ones. Snow crust cracked under my boots where the sun hit open spots. In the shade it held smooth, with a thin film of ice that showed sign well. I found my own prints, Mags's prints, deer slots, rabbit stitch marks, a raccoon's hand-like tracks near the compost barrel. Nothing that looked like a man coming and going with a blue tarp and a plan. No cigarette butts, no candy wrappers, no ATV tread, no boot heel pattern from the local feed store that half the county wore. The deep, broad tracks from earlier snow were softened now, edges rounded, but the pattern stayed strange. A curve around the house, pause near the stump, then back toward timber, without crossing into the yard the way a curious bear would. I squatted and touched one print where shade kept it from slumping, The depth went past my first knuckle through packed crust. Could be melt distortion, I said out loud because saying it made it feel sensible. Could be 2 tracks overlaid. Mag stood just behind my left shoulder and gave one low huff through her nose, like she had heard all this already and found it unconvincing. I straightened up with my knees popping and told myself, I know weight distribution. I know pressure points. I know what ground does under load. Then I looked at that broad heel impression again and thought, I also know when the numbers don't line up. Neat. The afternoon brought a weak sun that made the ice sheen off the fence wire, and routine took me over for a while. I replaced one cracked insulator on the south run, banged frozen mud off a gate hinge, topped off the stock trough where the heater kept a dinner plate opening from skinning over. Mags checked corners like always, nose low, working each scent lane with that old professional seriousness she brought to every chore. Twice she stopped, looked toward the ridge, and then back at me, tail moving slow and even. Not alert, not playful, more like acknowledgement, like she was noting another worker on the property and moving on. That evening, with the sky going amber behind the pines, I filled 2 mugs again. One for me, one for the stump. My hand hesitated over the second pour, then kept going anyway. Steam curled white in the cold. I took both outside. If this is Pete pranking me, I said to the darkening tree line, he's committed harder than I'd have guessed for a man with a bad shoulder. I set the enamel mug down, centered it on the cut ring of the stump, and gave it a little turn so the chipped side faced away. Like that mattered. Mags walked over, sniffed the rim, and sat beside it, as if she'd been assigned guard duty. I leaned on the porch post and watched her. You know something I don't? Her ears twitched, but she kept her eyes on the trees. The woods held that same patient quiet, not empty but attentive. Somewhere far off, a branch dropped snow with a soft thud. The smell of wet cedar drifted from the woodpile. Dusk settled in layers. I stood there till my coffee cooled, then went inside and didn't flip the TV on. That was new too. The next morning, the mug was empty and dry, tipped neither left nor right, set 3 feet from the stump beside a little scatter of rose hips, bright as old varnish in the snow. They hadn't been there at dusk. No torn branch nearby, no drag marks, no sign of an animal caching food. Just the mug and the rose hips, placed together like a small arrangement. Mags trotted up, sniffed once, then sat with her shoulder touching my shin. I crouched and examined the mug like a forensic tech, which would have been a sight for anybody passing by. No tooth marks, no bent handle, no mud inside. A faint ring where coffee had dried and then been rinsed by melt maybe, except the rim was cleaner than when I left it. I looked at the rose hips again, those red ovals against white crust, and an odd thought came uninvited. This looked less like scavenging and more like manners. I told myself this couldn't be real, I said, and heard how formal that sounded in my own mouth. Mags yawned huge and leaned against me harder. Fine, let's call it weather and coincidence with decorative flair. I stood up, mug in hand, and felt something loosen in my chest that wasn't exactly relief. More like a knot had gone slack 1 strand at a time. By late morning, I had to go into town for mineral blocks and a new cartridge for the water filter. At Harlan's feed, the heater by the register was cranked high enough to make the front windows sweat. Pete was near the seed bins, arguing with the scale under his breath. Claire came in from the diner side door carrying 2 cardboard trays of to-go cups and saw me at once. "You look less grey than last week," she said, setting one tray down. "That place feeding you decent yet?" "I've upgraded from microwave stew to oatmeal," I said. "Big culinary quarter." She gave me a sideways smile. "Progress is progress. You taking care of that dog?" Dog's taking care of me, I said, and that was plain truth. Pete shuffled over with his gloves tucked in his belt. Heard your ridge took freezing rain hard. It did. Lost half my dry kindling. I paused, then added, then didn't. Pete watched my face a second, reading it. Didn't. Found a fresh stack under tarp, sorted. I shrugged, casual as I could manage. Probably me from earlier in the week, forgot I did it. Pete grunted, not agreeing and not arguing. Memory does funny things in winter. He glanced out the window toward the hills we couldn't see from town. Your dad used to leave coffee on his porch rail for log truck drivers passing early, said warm hands made for safer corners. Maybe habit sticks to a place. Claire slid one of the cups from her tray toward me. Take this for the road. Black, no sugar. You always pretend you don't need it and then look half dead by noon. Then, quieter, with that diner practical kindness, she said, Roy, if your chest starts racing again, don't muscle through by yourself. You call somebody. Me, Pete, whoever picks up first. I nodded because my throat had gone tight. I will. I loaded feed into the truck, drove back up the ridge, and kept hearing Pete's line in my head. Maybe habit sticks to a place. By the time I hit the cattle guard at my gate, I had turned it over 6 different ways, and still couldn't file it into anything clean. I knew the difference between sentiment and sign. I also knew this place had held 3 generations of my people, doing small daily rituals until those rituals felt like architecture. Light the stove first. Check stock before breakfast. Save twine. Leave coffee for early passers. Maybe I wasn't the only one still moving by old habits out here. I carried sacks to the shed and found Mags waiting by the back steps with her whole body angled toward the stump. Not stiff, intent. She looked at me, then at the stump again. When I walked over, there were 2 smooth creek stones set in an X beside the mug, each one about the size of my palm. Both damp in a way that said they'd come from running water recently, not frozen ground near the house. I picked one up. It was cold and heavy and polished by current. No creek that size sat close to the steps. The nearest one that made stones this smooth was down beyond the lower pasture where alder crowded the banks. Well, I said, because no bigger sentence came. Mag stood and sniffed the second stone, then circled once and lay down beside both of them like they were part of inventory now. That night, the temperature dropped hard. Wind slid along the eaves with a low whistle, and frost laced the inside corners of the mudroom windows by dawn. I woke before first light, brewed coffee, and took a mug out to the stump while stars were still bright over the ridge. My breath smoked in the beam of the porch light. Snow squeaked under my boots. Mags padded ahead, stopped at the edge of light spill, and looked into the dark with her ears forward and tail moving once. Twice. I set the mug down and, without planning to, spoke to the trees like there was somebody standing just past them, listening close. Storm's coming by noon if the pressure's right, I said. If you're out there and if you're the one with the kindling and the odd decorating, I appreciate it. I rubbed the back of my neck, suddenly embarrassed, though nobody human was around to witness it. I know how that sounds. I'm still saying it. A branch shifted somewhere uphill, not snapping, just a weighted movement through needles. Mags did not bark. She sat. I sat on the chopping block because my knees felt watery and waited with her, the 2 of us side by side in the thin porch light, while dark held the yard in quiet layers. I wanted to run every practical explanation one more time, like tightening bolts in sequence. I am tired, I thought. I am alone too much. Grief bends perception. Panic scrambles certainty. These are known facts. Then another line came just as clear. None of that stacks dry kindling in freezing rain, places cups upright, or brings creek stones without breaking crust around them. I kept breathing slow, counting like the ER pamphlet said, and let both sets of facts sit together without forcing one to beat the other. Around sunrise, the wind eased and the woods brightened from black to deep blue. A raven crossed high overhead with 3 steady wing beats and drift. Chickadees started up in the brush by the fence line, tiny and busy as if somebody had flipped sound back on. Mags rose, stretched her stiff hip, and nudged my hand with her nose. I scratched behind her ear and felt the old familiar notch there from a barbed wire cut she got at 2 years old. Real dog, real cold, real mug on a stump. I didn't need a theory to name those. After breakfast, I went to split rounds behind the shed. The maul rang through frozen wood, each strike sharp enough to carry down canyon. Half an hour in, Mags left her patch of sun and walked to the tree line, then stopped and sat with her back to me, facing the firs. She stayed there while I worked, quiet, watchful, not guarding me exactly, but sharing watch with something I couldn't see. Every few minutes she looked over her shoulder to make sure I was still at it, then turned back. The pattern repeated long enough that it stopped feeling accidental. By midday, clouds rolled over and took the color out of everything. I stacked split oak under cover, then checked the stump. The mug was gone. My first thought was fox or raccoon finally playing havoc. My second thought, quick and clean, was no animal carries enamel by the handle and doesn't leave scrape marks. I followed a faint line of depressions in the crust that curved along the side yard, not quite prints, more places where weight had settled and released. They ended near the old horse trough where Mags liked to nap. There, set on the frozen board ledge as level as if placed by hand, sat my mug, upright, empty and clean enough inside to shine. I picked it up and held it under the grey light. The chipped enamel on the rim caught white. My reflection looked warped and older than I felt. "All right," I said softly. "Not to Mags this time. Not really." "I notice." Mags came and leaned against my leg, steady pressure through denim and long underwear and bone. I looked out past the trough to the first rank of fir trunks. Nothing moved. No shape stepped clear. The wind brought cedar and wet earth and that faint mineral smell that rises before snow. Curiosity settled in me then, deeper than nerves, broader than grief. It didn't erase what hurt. It just made room beside it. I carried the mug back to the house with both hands, rinsed it anyway out of habit, set it on the drying rack, and found myself planning tomorrow morning before I'd finished today. Fresh coffee, same stump, maybe a slice of cornbread left from supper if it kept overnight. I caught myself doing it and laughed under my breath. A month earlier, I could barely plan past dark. Now I was coordinating breakfast with whatever moved through my yard, like a careful neighbor with giant hands and better boundaries than most men at the shop. That afternoon, while wind started needling sleet against the west wall, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote a list for storm prep. Wrap north spigot again. Move hay bales off low pallets. Test fence alarm battery. Check generator oil. At the bottom, without thinking, I wrote, "Set second mug out early." The words sat there in my own blocky handwriting, plain as bolts on a workbench. I didn't cross them out. And that was how the evening went from ordinary chores into something I still measured my life against. I pulled my coat back on, tugged a knit cap down over my ears, and stepped into sleet that came sideways under a low, iron sky. The west wall clicked with frozen rain. The yard lights made each pellet look bright for a second, then gone. I wrapped the north spigot again, this time with an old wool sock over the foam because my father swore by wool for stubborn cold. Then I carried 2 flakes of hay to the lean-to and checked the latch twice. Mags shadowed me in that steady healer way. Never underfoot, always where she could watch my hands. When I came around the shed with the empty twine spool in my pocket, she stopped so abruptly I heard her claws tick on ice. Her ears were high, pointed at the fur stand beyond the fence line. I followed her gaze and saw only trunks striped dark with wet, branches shining silver where sleet had glazed the needles. Then a shape detached from shadow, not stepping out so much as becoming separate from the trees. Shoulder height above the top rail, broad through the chest. Dark fur with a pale dusting where weather had caught it. He moved one foot, slowly, and set it down like he was testing whether the ground would complain. My first feeling was not fear. It was scale. Scale and care, both at once, and that combination scrambled every neat category I had. He was close enough for me to see water bead on the longer hair along his forearm. Far enough that he stayed outside the yard proper, outside the porch light spill, outside the space I thought of as mine. Mags looked up at him and did not bark. He paused until she looked back toward me, then shifted his weight and angled one step farther behind a trunk, giving her room to settle again. It was the most considerate movement I had ever seen from anything that size. I stood still with sleet tapping my shoulders and my gloves starting to soak through, and my mind ran the usual drill because that was what it knew how to do. A large bear with mange, a trick of light and branch overlap. Stress plus isolation, plus too many nights sleeping light. I told myself this couldn't be real, then watched him turn his head slightly and track a gust moving across the pasture, and the motion had too much intention in it to be weather-playing games. I wanted to run and I wanted to stay, and both impulses sat side by side until neither won. He remained where he was, patient, no push in him at all. "Evening," I said finally, because I had apparently become the kind of man who greeted silhouettes in freezing rain. He didn't move for 3 breaths. Then he inclined his head once, a small downward dip, and stepped backward into the furs with the same measured care. Needles shook, then went still. Just like that. Mags exhaled and leaned against my leg. I reached down and rubbed the rough fur behind her ear while my pulse knocked too hard in my throat. "You saw that," I said. "Tell me you saw that." She gave me one look that translated cleanly to yes, and also maybe keep up, Roy. Inside, I peeled wet layers off and hung them by the stove, then stood at the sink with both palms on the counter until the trembling in my fingers eased. I considered calling Pete and reporting exactly what I'd seen, then pictured the silence on the line and decided against it. I did call him 15 minutes later for a reason I could name out loud. He answered on the 3rd ring. Holloway. "Pete, you hearing anything new on this front?" "Widowmakers dropping faster than forecast. County radio says black ice by midnight and hard north wind by dawn. You got fuel and feed high?" "Working it now." "Then don't quit early. Wrap what you think is enough and then wrap it again." He paused. "You sound winded." "Just cold." He let that hang there. "Roy, if you need a second pair of hands, I can send Tyler up with chains in the morning." "I'm all right tonight." "All right. Keep the dog in when the gusts turn. Call if your fence alarm starts singing." I thanked him and set the phone down. The kitchen hummed with refrigerator noise and stove crackle. Outside, sleet ticked harder on the window glass. I poured fresh coffee into my mug, filled the second enamel mug, and took it out to the stump with a flashlight beam cutting white through the dark. "Storm service," I muttered, setting it down. Hot and black. I expected nothing else that night, and for an hour nothing else happened. I tested the generator. I checked the mudroom lantern batteries. I coiled an extension cord near the back door. When I stepped out again close to moonrise, The sleet had eased to a fine, drifting ice that made the yard glow faint blue. The second mug sat where I'd left it, empty now, with no spill on the stump. I was looking at that when Mags walked past me and sat 3 paces into the yard, tail low and easy, facing the fallen cottonwood log by the fence. He was there, seated on the log as if he had always been part of it. Moonlight laid a dim line along one shoulder and the top of his head. His hands rested open on his knees, palms angled inward, fingers long and relaxed. Not clenched, not reaching. Waiting. I could hear my own breathing and the tiny crystalline hiss of freezing mist settling on dry grass. He watched me the way old horses do when they're deciding whether you're calm enough to approach. Then he did something so plain and careful, it settled my heart faster than any breathing exercise. He rose, took 3 slow steps to the stump, picked up the empty mug by the handle with 2 fingers, looked inside, set it back down upright in the exact center, and retreated the same 3 steps to the log. He sat again. Open hands, space kept between us. I stayed on the porch step, knees bent, forearms on my thighs. "You don't spook easy either, huh?" I said quietly. No answer in words, just a slight turn of his head toward Mags when she shifted position, then back to me. His eyes caught moonlight for a second, amber brown, steady as creek water in late summer. Nothing hungry in them, nothing hurried. I had spent months feeling like a man people checked off a list and moved past. Too complicated, too tired, too much trouble to sort out. Sitting there in that cold blue yard, I had the odd, clean sense of being seen without being assessed. I remember thinking, in a very practical way, I should be documenting this. Photos, video, measurements, proof for the part of me that still filed life by evidence tags. Instead, I sat there with my hands going numb through my gloves and watched him breathe. Slow in, slow out. I matched him without meaning to. My chest loosened. There was a moment, 30 or 40 seconds maybe, where I almost stood and walked closer. Then I pictured how big he was up close and stayed put, which was probably wise. I laughed under my breath at myself anyway. I had once rebuilt a transmission with no manual and no spare parts in 12 hours, but I was now politely remaining on my own porch because I didn't want to crowd a giant stranger who had better manners than most dinner guests. "Thank you for the wood," I said after a while. "And the stones, and not flattening my fence when you could." His shoulders shifted with what looked like an exhale. He tilted his head once, same small nod as before. We stayed that way a long stretch, long enough the moon slid clear of one branch and lit the frost on the trough. Mags eventually lay down between us, chin on paws, as if she had brokered a truce and considered the matter done. When the cold finally bit through my jeans, I stood slowly and backed toward the door. "I'm going in," I said. "Storm prep starts early." He rose when I rose, not advancing, only acknowledging the movement. I stepped inside, turned once at the window, and saw him already at the tree line, broad shape blending back into fur shadow until he was gone. I slept in broken pieces, listening for the fence alarm between dreams, and woke before dawn to wind. Not full gale yet, but the kind with intent. At 6:30, the kitchen thermometer read 12 degrees and falling. I built the fire up, fed Mags, poured 2 mugs, and set one on the stump while stars were still visible in the west. The mug steamed in the dark, like a signal flare. By 8, Widowmaker showed its teeth. The north wind came down the draw hard enough to shove at the eaves. Snow skittered in low snakes across the yard. I worked through the storm list with a pencil behind my ear and a wrench in my pocket, moving quick between buildings. At the generator shed, I discovered my first mistake. I had left the big unit farther from the porch than I should have, and the narrow path to drag it was now a glaze of black ice over packed snow. I hooked the tow strap and leaned into it. The generator moved 4 inches and stopped like it had rooted itself. I reset my boots, pulled again, and my right foot slid out so fast I went down on one knee, palm slapping ice hard enough to sting through the glove. Mags barked once, sharp, then fell quiet, watching beyond me. Panic flashed in my chest, that old electrical surge, not from fear of him this time, but from being overwhelmed by one more practical failure at the exact wrong hour. Wind, cold, dead weight machine, too much to do, too little daylight. I crouched there and counted like the pamphlet said. In for 4. Hold for 4, out for 6. When I looked up, he stood 10 yards off, just beyond the shed corner, half screened by blowing snow. He waited until I met his gaze. Then he pointed, not at me, at the generator handle. "All right," I said, voice rough in the wind. "Yeah, that would help." He approached in a wide arc so he didn't pass close behind me, every step deliberate on the ice. He bent, slid one massive hand under the generator frame and the other to the side rail, and lifted as if it were an empty cooler. No strain in his shoulders. He kept it level, careful of the fuel slosh, and carried it to the porch pad where the overhang blocked most of the wind. He set it down gently on 2 stacked planks I'd forgotten to place there, exactly where I would have wanted it to keep it out of meltwater. I stood with the tow strap still in my hand, mouth open like an idiot. "You've got to be kidding me," I said softly, and even as I said it, I was smiling, because disbelief had finally exhausted itself, and what replaced it was cleaner. Wonder, yes. Also gratitude so direct it made my eyes burn. He looked from me to the extension cord coiled by the door, then reached with 2 fingers and nudged the cord nearer the generator outlet. Not plugging it in, just putting it where my numb hands could do the rest quickly. Then he stepped back 3 paces and waited. "Thank you," I said, and this time I meant more than one thing. Mags trotted up to him, stopped at arm's length, and sat. He lowered his hands slowly, palm down. She leaned forward, sniffed once, then wagged her tail in that measured way she used when she'd made a final decision about somebody. He didn't touch her. He just held still while snow caught in the fur along his knuckles. The wind gusted harder, carrying a dry rattle through the cedar branches. He turned his head toward the lower pasture, then back to me, and made a soft chest sound, low and brief, more felt than heard. A warning, maybe, a reminder. Work to do. "Yeah," I said, following his line of sight. "I know. I'm going." He gave that slight nod again, then moved off along the fence line, staying on the outside edge as always, dark shape easing into white drift and fur shadow. Not disappearing like a trick, just leaving, unhurried, like a neighbor heading back across his own field after helping you right a load. I got the generator started on the second pull, ran the cord, checked the well pump drawer, and moved to the next task with a steadier pulse than I'd had in months. At the stump, sometime before noon, I found my enamel mug set upside down so snow couldn't gather in it, tucked tight against the lee side where wind wouldn't tip it. A small thing, a practical thing. Practical. Exactly the kind of kindness my father used to call the real kind, because it met the day you were actually having. I put the mug in my pocket and headed for the lower pasture with Mags at my heel, the wind in my face, and one new certainty anchored deep. Whatever shared this ridge with us did not want anything from me except room, respect, and the chance to help when weather turned mean. I put my head down into the wind and started for the lower pasture, and halfway to the gate, the kitchen alarm chirped through the open back window, one thin electronic pulse that meant fence voltage had dropped somewhere near the carving shed. Mags heard it too. She swung ahead of me, stiff hip forgotten, and cut down the tractor track while sleet needled both of us from the north. The pasture fell away in a white-grey slope, and runoff from the afternoon glaze had started moving again under the new snow. Black ribbons of water finding old ruts and turning them slick. By the time I reached the shed, my gloves were soaked at the fingertips and my jaw hurt from clenching. One corner post had leaned where the ground softened, and 2 strands of wire had sagged into a tight snarl around the front legs of a red heifer I'd been watching all week. She wasn't down yet, but she was close, trembling and wide-eyed, pulling in short, desperate jerks that only tightened the loops. Water from the upper ditch was spilling through the open gate track and rising around her hooves, slush and ice chunks slapping at the boards. I talked to her the way my dad taught me, low and steady, while I fumbled the fence pliers from my coat. "Easy, girl, easy now. I got you." I didn't have her, not yet. The wire was twisted with old barb and fresh high tensile, frozen together where wet had flashed to ice, and every second my hands lost heat. I braced one knee in mud and tried to lever the tangle open, and the pliers slipped, and the heifer lurched, and one barb nicked my sleeve and snagged deeper. My heart kicked hard, then harder, that old runaway rhythm that made the edges of my vision narrow. I could hear myself breathing too fast inside my scarf. I am here, I told myself, and I am doing the next thing. Cut wire, free leg, move her uphill. That is all. The wind shoved at my back, and the wire hummed under strain, and for one sharp second I felt that familiar terror that I was about to fail something that depended on me. Mags barked once behind me, not alarmed, just calling my attention left. A dark shape moved through the sleet beyond the shed wall and came into view without rush, broad shoulders taking snow, head bowed slightly against the gusts. He stopped 10 feet off, outside my reach and the heifer's panic arc, and waited until I looked at him. Then he stepped in. He set one massive forearm against the leaning post to steady it, fingers spanning weathered cedar like it was a broom handle, and with his other hand, he pinched the worst of the twisted wire between thumb and 2 fingers, and lifted. Not ripped. Lifted and peeled, deliberate as a man untying a knot in fishing line. The frozen strands separated with a metallic snap that I felt through my knees. He held the wire high while I slid in and pulled the loop clear of the heifer's left leg, then the right, talking all the while to keep her from bolting into the gate. She shook so hard her teeth clicked. He lowered the wire behind us only when she was clear. "Up," I told her, voice cracking. "Come on, up." She tried and skated. Before she could scramble back down into the runoff, he moved to her downhill side and turned his body broad against the wind, making a wall. He made that same low chest sound I'd heard by the shed, a soft, rolling rumble, steady and unforced. The heifer's ears twitched toward him. She planted, took one careful step, then another. I grabbed her halter strap and led uphill while he paced 2 steps behind and to the side, never crowding, just holding that windbreak line with his own body so the gusts hit him first. Mags flanked her right side like we'd practiced for years. We got her into the upper paddock and latched the panel. She stood there shivering, but she stood. I checked her legs with numb fingers, expecting heat or swelling. There was only surface scrape and tremor, no break, no deep cut. Relief hit so hard my knees went weak. I sat back in slush and mud without meaning to, then folded forward with both hands on the frozen ground and started crying in big, rough breaths that had been waiting months for a way out. I cried for my mother and the way I'd stood in a funeral suit feeling nothing until everybody else left. I cried for my daughter, hearing my polite, careful messages and not hearing the truth beneath them. I cried for the shop floor and that bright panic under fluorescent lights, and for all the nights at the homestead when I'd eaten standing up because sitting still felt dangerous. I cried because I had just watched a creature big enough to tear a gate apart choose instead to save one heifer with more patience than I could manage for myself. Mud soaked through my jeans. Snow melted on my neck and ran cold down my spine. I stayed there anyway, shoulders shaking, with no part of me trying to hide. When I finally looked up, he was 20 feet away by the paddock corner, turned slightly to give me privacy in the strangest, kindest way. Not staring, not leaving either. Mags came and pressed along my side, warm where she could be warm, and leaned until my breathing slowed to something I recognized as mine. "I'm sorry," I said to no one, and both of them. He angled his head, waited. "I'm not sorry," I corrected, wiping my face with a muddy glove and laughing once through the last of it. Guess that needed doing. The wind shifted and he turned toward the north wall of the shed and pointed, arm extending slow and clear. I followed his line and saw what I'd missed. The heat tape on the exposed section of waterline had come loose where an old staple failed. Insulation flapping and already frosting over. Another hour in this cold and I'd have had a split pipe and a flooded crawl space. "Right," I said, pushing up to my feet. "Good eye, better than mine tonight." I grabbed fresh tape and foam wrap from the shed tote and knelt by the line, fingers clumsy but moving. He stood windward while I worked, taking the gusts that would have frozen my hands completely. Twice he shifted to block blowing ice from the open seam while I cinched tape tight. When I finished, he touched the wrapped section lightly with one knuckle, as if confirming hold, then stepped back. "Thank you," I said again, simpler each time. He gave the small nod I'd come to recognize. Then, because the night still had work left, he walked with me to the gate where the downed post leaned. I braced it upright while he pressed the base into firmer ground with one careful heel. I set 2 T-posts and wired them off. He held the flashlight I'd clipped to the fence with a precision that made me shake my head in disbelief. If anybody had told me a month earlier I'd spend a storm night doing repairs with a silent giant and a cattle dog supervising both of us, I would have asked what they slipped in my coffee. By the time we finished, my watch said 2:43 a.m. The worst gusts had started to lose force, though the cold still bit mean. He turned toward the tree line, paused, then looked back at the paddock where the heifer now stood under hay, with her head low and breathing easier. He watched her for a full 5 seconds, as if taking inventory, then looked at me once more. "I'll keep watch from the house," I said. "You did enough." He held my gaze, amber brown and steady, and there was no drama in it, only acknowledgement. He moved off between the outer fence and the first row of firs, each step placed so quietly for his size it still unsettled my sense of scale. Mags watched him go, then turned and trotted toward the porch without waiting for a command. Inside, I stripped wet clothes in the mudroom, put dry flannel on with hands that still shook, and sat at the kitchen table with a blanket around my shoulders and Mags at my feet. The fence alarm stayed quiet. The stove ticked and breathed. Out the window, the storm slackened from roar to hiss. I rested my forehead against my knuckles and whispered, "I am not unseen." Saying it out loud felt like fitting a key I had carried for years without knowing the lock it belonged to. When dawn finally thinned the dark, it came pale and washed clean, the kind of winter light that made every fence wire look newly drawn. The thermometer climbed from 9 to 14 in an hour. I walked out to the ditch and saw water moving free instead of grinding under ice. The creek below the ridge ran loud again, brown and alive. Widowmaker had broken. I checked the heifer first. She was stiff but steady, nosing hay and giving me the annoyed look healthy cattle give when you fuss too much. I took that as a blessing. I reset the sagged section of fence, tested voltage, and listened for the satisfying click of current jumping where it should. Mags made her rounds, tail level, pausing once at the edge of the yard to sniff air and look uphill. Then I saw the stump. My enamel mug sat in the centre, chip turned away, clean as if it had just come off a store shelf. It was filled to the brim with clear water that caught the morning sun and threw a thin, bright line across the bark. Around it lay cedar tips arranged in a spiral, each sprig placed stem to tip in widening circles, green against snow like a little map of wind and patience. No trampled ring around the stump, no chaos, just intention. I lifted the mug with both hands. The water was ice cold but not frozen, and when I took a sip, it tasted like the spring above the north pasture, mineral and sweet with stone. My throat tightened all over again, but this time the feeling was lighter, more like awe than grief. Mags lapped once from my palm when I dipped my fingers, then sneezed and sat down beside me, eyes on the ridge. He stood there at the far tree line where mist still clung low between trunks, broad and still in the grey-gold light. Distance softened detail, but I could see his stance, open and easy, no claim in it. We looked at each other across maybe 80 yards of snow and fence and old field. I raised the mug. "Coffee's still on," I said, voice carrying thin in the cold. "Every morning." He inclined his head one last time. Then he turned and walked into the mist, not vanishing, not theatrical, simply receding between cedar and fir until dark fir became shadow and shadow became part of the woods again. I stood there long after I couldn't pick him out, listening. First a chickadee, then another. A jay started up near the woodpile with all the rude confidence of normal life returning. The air smelled of thawing cedar bark and wet soil under snow. Mags bumped my knee and I scratched her neck without looking down. Back in the kitchen, I called Pete to tell him the storm damage tally. He answered with a cough and a, "You upright?" "Upright," I said. "Lost one corner post by the carving shed. Got a heifer tangled, but she's fine. Waterline almost let go and didn't. Generator ran clean." "Good. I'm making rounds after noon. Want me to swing by with extra wire?" "If you can spare it, yeah." He grunted. "I'll bring coffee too. Real stuff, not that engine degreaser you drink." "You're one to talk." When he pulled in after lunch, the roads were still glazed in shade patches. He brought wire, staples, and a dented thermos. We walked the lower fence together in quiet that felt companionable, not strained. At the shed corner, he paused by a set of broad impressions half-preserved, where drift had sheltered them. "Those yours?" he asked mildly. "Nope." He studied the print, then looked toward the ridge and back at me. "Ground held deep last night," he said. "Took weight to make that." It did. He drove staples while I tensioned wire. After a minute, he said, "Your dad once told me this ridge had old things in it that minded their own business unless weather got mean." I kept my eyes on the fence clip. Maybe he was right. Pete nodded as if we'd settled a practical matter like tire pressure. No grin, no wink. "Well, whatever helped, I'm obliged to it for saving your heifer. She's good stock." When he left, he set his thermos on my hood and said, "Don't list this place in a hurry, Roy. Winter talks loud. Best not sign papers in the middle of it." The for sale folder sat on my kitchen table that evening, realtor card clipped to the top. I opened it, read the listing notes about acreage and outbuildings and good potential with updates, and felt nothing in my chest except a clear no. I called the agent before I could second-guess it. "Roy, good timing," she said. "I had a couple from South County asking about—" "Dana, I'm pulling it." A pause. "Pulling the listing?" "Yeah, indefinitely." "You sure? We can hold until spring and revisit." "I'm sure." Her tone softened. All right, I'll close the file on my end. If you want to talk numbers later, call me. Thanks. I hung up and turned the family photos face up on the mantel one by one. My mother in her church hat. Emmy at 12 with braces and gap-toothed grin. A faded one of Dad holding me by the suspenders at 5, both of us squinting into sun. I stood there until the room blurred, then sat at the table with a yellow legal pad and wrote Dear Emmy at the top of a clean page. The first letter took me 3 false starts and 1 full pot of coffee. I wrote that I'd been ashamed and quiet and wrong about thinking distance was easier for her than honesty. I wrote about the panic spell without dressing it up. I wrote that I missed her, and that missing her had scared me because it made me face how much I'd shrunk my life. I did not write about him in that first letter. That truth felt private in a different way. But I wrote about the storm, the heifer, the way helping something vulnerable had cracked me open and put me back together straighter than before. I wrote, If you can, write me back. If you can't yet, I understand, and I'll write again anyway. At the post office in town the next morning, my hand hesitated over the slot. The clerk behind the counter glanced up from a stack of flat-rate boxes and said, You mailing taxes or apologies? Second one, I said. Good man. He nodded at the envelope in my hand. To Emmy? Yeah. He tapped the edge of the mail slot with 2 fingers. Then put it in before your fear gets chatty. I slid it through. That afternoon I left a fresh mug on the stump. The next morning it was empty and set just off-center beside 2 cedar tips laid parallel. The day after, untouched. I kept doing it anyway. Not as bait, not as proof for anybody else. As practice in gratitude. As a way to begin the day looking outward instead of inward. Weeks passed in weather and work, and I marked them by small scenes that would have bored my old frantic self and steadied the man I was becoming. One Thursday, with meltwater dripping from eaves, I sat at the table repairing a lantern wick when the phone rang, and Emmy's name lit the screen. I stared long enough it almost went to voicemail. Hey, I said, too formal. Her voice came careful at first. Hey, Dad, I got your letter. Okay, long breath on the line. I read it twice. Then I got mad. Then I read it again. I can take that. I know. Another breath, softer. I wrote back. It should be there tomorrow, but I wanted to hear your voice. My throat closed. I gripped the table edge and looked out at the stump through the window. I'm here, I said. I'm listening. We talked 32 minutes about nothing and everything. Her work at a dental office, my busted fence post, her memory of Grandma's cinnamon rolls, my memory of missing her high school choir concert because I took overtime and told myself I had no choice. I apologized without excuses. She did not forgive all at once, and I didn't ask her to. We ended with, Call Sunday. And both said yes, like it mattered. By first green up, Pete and I were replacing rot at the porch steps. He was crowbarring old planks when he said, You're different. Better or worse? Quieter in the right places, he said. Louder in the useful ones. I laughed. That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Don't spread it around. We worked until sunset. Before he left, he noticed the second mug drying by the sink and said nothing at all, which from Pete counted as respect. Emmy came in early June, driving a dusty sedan with 2 houseplants buckled into the back seat. She stepped out wearing old sneakers and my mother's denim jacket she'd kept after the funeral. For a second, we just stood there by the porch, both uncertain where to put our hands. Then she walked up and hugged me hard enough to knock air out of my chest. Mags approved immediately and leaned against both our legs until we laughed. We spent that weekend doing plain things. Tightening a loose cabinet hinge, walking the pasture at dusk, eating grilled cheese at the counter because the table was covered in sandpaper and paint swatches. Saturday morning, I poured 2 mugs plus the stump mug, and Emmy watched me set the 3rd cup outside. She raised an eyebrow. New habit? Yeah, I said. One that did me good. She studied my face, then nodded like she understood more than I'd said. All right. That evening, after she'd gone to bed in her old room, I stepped onto the porch. Summer insects hummed in the grass. A barred owl called once from the creek drawer. The stump mug was empty, handle turned east. Beside it lay a crow feather and a smooth stone-striped green. I picked them up and set them on the windowsill over the sink next to my father's chipped ceramic trout. Seasons turned, not in a montage, in mornings. Frost feathering the bucket rim in October while steam lifted from 2 mugs and 1 stump cup. January wind rattling the eaves while I pulled my collar up and set coffee out under a moon gone thin. April rain tapping the porch roof while new cedar tips brightened along the fence line. Most days the cup came back empty. Some days it sat untouched. A handful of mornings brought small arrangements that made me smile into my collar like a fool. Rose hips, crossed stones, one perfect spiral of dry grass that survived a night of rain because it had been tucked under the stump lip where runoff missed. I never told the story for argument. I told it the way I'm telling it now, to people who asked from a place of care and sometimes to nobody, just to the dark kitchen while I rinsed mugs. The prevailing view in town stayed what you'd expect. A few smiled politely, a few changed the subject. Pete once, when we were mending a gate in Sleet, said, "World's bigger than our categories, Roy," and handed me another staple. That was enough. What changed was non-trivial and plain at once. Panic still visited sometimes, but it no longer ran the house. When my chest tightened at dusk, I breathed through it and kept my feet under me. I went back to the shop part-time in August, then full by winter, and when the younger guys asked where I'd been, I said, "Learning how to come back," and left it there. I called Emmy every Sunday whether conversation was easy or awkward. I wrote letters when words felt safer on paper. She visited at Thanksgiving and taught me to make the cinnamon rolls my mother never wrote down because she measured by feel. We got flour everywhere. We laughed until Mags barked at us for being rowdy indoors. The homestead stayed mine. More importantly, it became mine in a healthier way than inheritance papers could enforce. I repaired what was broken because I wanted to live there, not because I was waiting to leave. I stopped moving through rooms like a trespasser. I looked at the photos each morning. I said their names out loud. I kept 1 second mug on the porch hook and 1 enamel cup by the back door, ready for dawn. Last week, before first light, I stepped out in a thin fog with coffee in both hands and set the extra cup on the stump. Mags is gone now, buried under the cottonwood she used to nap beside, and I still find myself glancing down, expecting her shoulder against my knee. Grief visits in gentler clothes these days. I stood there listening to the ridge wake, waiting without demand. Somewhere uphill, a branch flexed under weight and released. I smiled into the steam. "Morning," I said to the trees, to memory, to the kindness that met me when I had nothing to offer but a joke and a chipped mug. "Thanks for seeing me through." Then I went inside to start the day, steadier than the man who first walked out that sleeting dawn, carrying wood, carrying loss, carrying wonder, and carrying one quiet faith that the world still holds room for unasked for care.